We want to jointly to create a more healthier community. So that's why I'm going to introduce our keynote speaker, also my friend, Yuna, to the stage. I met her at a very first comic book launch event that is this spring. I remember it's back to March 2026. Yuna, she's the author of two comic books. That's a series named I'm Speaking and I'm Awake. Now it has been translated into more than 10 different languages. And we are likely to have those comic books in the back. Feel free to take it home. If you don't have that many, bring the words home that let your community know that we have those comic books available. I don't know how to describe detailed about the content, so I'm glad to invite Yuna to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the intro. And, I just want to first say that it wasn't one person, like the theme is with every panelist here. It really was a community effort that made it possible to have a comic series like that and to have all the translations. And what was really great is that it wasn't just something that came from my own experience, but it was through different organizations. So I work in a nonprofit. It's called Korean Community Services. I'm also a social worker and the director of a mental health clinic that's operated by the nonprofit. And so we, a lot of AAPI organizations partner under bigger Asian coalitions and non-Asian coalitions, right? And so New York Immigration Coalition had reached out and said, it would be really great if you can create a mental health resource. So we created one separately. And then later they said, well, it would be even greater, we can do something for youth. So the first one, I'm Speaking, came out of that. And it was also during the time of COVID and during the time of, a lot of the anti-Asian hate. And so it goes into the theme of speaking in terms of us speaking up about our struggles, like in mental health, and also speaking about things that happen and encouraging not just ourselves, but adults too, right? Because there's a lot in like not just about Asian culture, but about being an immigrant where people feel like there's risks to speaking or like, is my voice even going to be heard? And so you'll hopefully, if you get to read the comic, you'll see the different layers of how those things play out with youth and with our parents, and hopefully an encouragement on what we can do and what resources we can turn to. So first comic is called I'm Speaking. Second comic is called I'm Wide Awake. I actually reached out to my high school teacher. I'm dating myself, but basically a high school teacher from 30 years ago. We got on a Zoom call because I said, I kind of want to remember what it was like to talk to, like I want to remember what a high school teacher sounded like. And we really used a lot of actual references from history to talk on different levels about being, actually the term woke. Do people know what woke is? Like you hear the term woke, like someone's woke, right? So there's actually an older word from Abraham Lincoln's time. There was a youth group called the Wide Awakes. So anyway, they're featured in there, and it's to talk about like multiple ways of us looking at being wide awake. And even though the word woke is associated with, liberal views, the idea is that, when we talk about mental health and when we talk about being aware and being engaged, that it doesn't matter, it's not about politics. However, an important part is that I do directly address immigration there. There's characters that are like youth who have like parents who are ICE, and then other youth who are impacted by ICE. And so that part gets really interesting. And I think the reason that people in the New York Immigration Coalition found that valuable is because I was able to directly tie that with some of the resources that they can turn to, after kind of reading the story, and hopefully that message resonates. The other thing is that, as high school students, I've talked to different high school students about how often they go to their counselors or, what is the outreach like? And I know every school is very different. So I thought it was important to be able to do like a hypothetical scenario in the story. So in both stories, you'll see a school counselor featured, and it's not the template for what a counseling session looks like, but it's like a hypothetical, like you might imagine this kind of dynamic, right? Or like this character might feel these kinds of things when they go in. And maybe like when you talk to a counselor, you might expect to feel this other thing. So I just wanted to lead with that. That was actually not I did have something prepared, but I thought those were important. So listening to everyone today and thinking about all the preparation that went to this, it was very clear to me. So the topics are leadership, community building, and personal growth. And I feel like those are connected to the role we have in creating more welcoming, inclusive, and supportive communities. So I think, the themes I just talked about with the comics are all about creating inclusion, right? Creating support. And a lot of it, I want to tie it back to love again. I love the love question. It's because, when we talk about anti-Asian hate or bias and hate crimes in general, like the opposite is, love. Like the opposite is when people can accept each other. You don't need to love your neighbors, but you can, accept that they are different from you and that they have every, right, and they should have every opportunity. And I think it's when people experience a lot of those negative things that we need to support each other on the societal level, and we need to work on things at a societal level, but we also need to work on things personally. And what I mean by that is that can really make a toll on, that can really take a toll on how you feel about yourself, right? And those are the things that we talk about when we talk about mental health, and when we talk about creating support, because that's the emotional core where we talk about like how does what I feel directly connect with my motivation to do everything, right? So like it was very inspiring. Like I even took notes as as people younger than me like are creating nonprofits and having all these realizations as they get involved. And I also think it's really important to remember that for many people, it's hard because, well, like a lot of it is emotions, right? And how we believe things about the world depends on the kinds of emotions that you feel when a lot of these things happen in the world. I actually was going to start this conversation by saying, today's event really resonated with me more than a lot of the other panels I've been on, because I wish I had a panel like this when I was a youth, right? When I was younger. But it's bittersweet, right? Because now more than ever, right, people are finally talking about Asian American history, right? Like we are having people advocate for the AAPI community. We didn't really have that as much years ago. But on the other hand, like we need to do that because we are not sufficiently represented. And we need to have nonprofits because, if the government had the people, I don't know if people know the stats, but like if you take the number of Asians and the amount of funding that we should get, right, we don't get that automatically. Like people need to take the initiative and apply for grants, as mentioned, right? And so there's a lot to be done, but there's also a lot of our inner work and our needing to be compassionate with ourselves, right? So I think it's also important, when we hear kind of recommendations about what we need to do, to be okay if you can't always get there. And I think, once you can more easily accept that it's hard. It's really hard being a young person. It's really hard being an adult, right? So once you can accept that it's not meant to be easy, it will be easier to sort of let go of this, I need to be successful. I need to make my parents happy. I need to get into a good college. Because as I mentioned, I'm a social worker, so I have my clinic director role, but when I talk to a lot of youth or adults in counseling, a lot of times, a lot of the time you need to study for your test. People are just filled with anxiety and they're just worried, right? They're thinking about their parents' expectations, or they even want to make sure their tutor is happy, right? And so we work on how do you just really just let go of those things? Because in a way, by taking care of your mental health, you're going to do better in school, right? So the goal isn't to, talk about like getting good grades here today, but what I wanted to really emphasize is that everything is connected, right? Like what we do in our free time, and then what we're expected, what we're required to do is really like they don't live separately from each other. And I want to go back to talking about what we do for ourselves and what we do for other people. We can feel very limited in what we can do, right? I think creating nonprofits and making, like everything people share right now is about making the world a better place. I think there's a lot of creation that we can do, but there's also like things you cannot control about one person, right? And the biggest person is sometimes ourselves. So the single step that we do is things that we do every day. So in terms of coming to a more inclusive, welcoming society, it can be one person when you're in school or in the summer where you feel that they need some kind of help, right? But then every case is going to be different. That can mean a lot of things. So if that is the case and you feel like, oh, I feel like, it would be important to reach out to this person, then to think about like what is like making you feel that, right? And to figure out like what are the different things you can do. So that's to others. And then we need to also do that for ourselves, right? Like if you feel like you are stuck, right? If you feel, and I think people have talked about that today, and like I think that's a perfect example of why it works, because if you say like, okay, I can't figure this out on my own, like don't torture yourself. Reach out, and I think the barrier to that, it's not just like, it's more effective to talk about why we don't do it, right? So I'm not here to say like, hey, don't do that. It's more like you're naturally gonna feel, I'm repeating things, but like you are gonna have to face some kind of fear, some kind of uncertainty. And it's important, and it's normal to feel that way about being vulnerable and sharing. And then I think the bigger, like larger questions is like using your emotions and channeling it into some kind of work or community activity that ends up helping you feel empowered and is even therapeutic. So for me, I wrote the first comic, in conversation with the nonprofit, and then everything happened in the news. I was seeing ICE, I was seeing all this stuff happening in Minnesota. It was really beautiful how they were calling, people in their town neighbors, right? But to be honest, like, and I know other nonprofits are aware of this too, everyone was afraid about what their stance would look like to the government or like things like that. And for me, it was actually it felt very good that I could write about youth, right? And there was more freedom in doing something that's creative. And so ultimately, it was therapeutic to be able to write that story, and also create it in a way where I wasn't trying to take a side, but for the characters to just speak for themselves. So for that one, I actually had reached out to them, and I said, "Hey, I have this idea. Do you have funding?" and then they were like, "Well, we'll look into it." And then they said, "Yeah, we do." And then we did it. So that's, I think, another example and an encouragement to you to, you never know, right? That's also how I got on a podcast too. Not because I wanted to be on a podcast, but because I really felt like there was something important that I wanted to share. And I think one last thing, I've right now been talking about my work in the Asian American community, my work in a Korean nonprofit. Before that, I worked as a social worker, I worked at Rikers Island. Do people know the jail? It's a jail in New York. It's a very large jail. So I was there as a therapist for 5.5 years. And it was a really important point. And that was actually the reason I was on that podcast. It was called Black and Yellow Podcast. And the idea was to, they like to focus on cross-racial solidarity. And when we talk about having welcoming, inclusive communities, I think it's really important to be rooted in your community and care for it. And it's also valuable to have experiences in your life where you can go to places where people don't look like you, who may not understand your culture. I was like around, and it was like men's facility, so it was just, black and brown men for so it was a very different environment, but I learned so much from it. And I think those are the kinds of things that is also really important to making the world, more like understanding of each other, and for us to better empathize and have compassion.